A very warm welcome to this new session. My name is Ms. Prachivani, and today we will talk about the gap model, which is very important when we talk about service quality. So let's start with this quote by Mr. Peter Drucker, which says, quality in a service or product is not what you put into it. It is what the customer gets out of it. So what is service? According to Mr. Philip Kotler, it is an action or an activity which can be offered by a party to another party, which is basically intangible and cannot affect any ownership. And what is quality? Quality is nothing but the degree of excellence and superiority in kind. In this case, if a company accepts the view that quality needs consistency, meeting or exceeding customers' expectations, then the manager's task is to balance the customer's expectations and perceptions and to make sure that the gaps are closed in between two or more gaps. Let us accept and understand that there are gaps in service design and when the service is getting delivered. The researchers have identified a total of 5 gaps that can occur at various points during the design and delivery of the service performance. The gap model of service quality is an important customer satisfaction framework in a conceptual model of service quality and its implication for future research. The researchers have identified 5 major gaps that the organizations face when they are seeking to meet customers' expectations of the customer experience. Gaps at point in service design and delivery can damage the relationships with customers. The service gap is very critical. Hence, the goal should be improving the service quality by closing the gaps or narrowing the gaps. Improving service quality requires identifying the cause for each gap and then have a strategy for the same. Now, we're talking about 5 service quality gaps, which was developed in 1985. There's also a modified model, which is of 7 service quality gaps. This was published in 1994. So in this PPT, we will talk about 7 service quality gaps. So here we will be talking about the traditional model and also 2 additional gaps which are added. So let's begin. The first gap that we have is in between the customer needs and expectations and in between management decisions or definitions of these needs. That's called as the knowledge gap. Now, there's also a gap in between management's definition of the needs and translating them into design or delivery spaces or specifications. That's called as the standards gap. The third gap is translation into design delivery specifications into execution of design and delivery specifications. Now that gap is called as a delivery gap. The next gap is translation into design service specification and actually communicating the same to the advertising and sales promotion team. That's called as the internal communication gap. The next gap is in between the execution of design and delivery specifications and customers' perception of product execution. That's called as the perception gap. Now, these are typical 5 gaps that we have spoken about. There are additional 2 gaps, which are in between the advertising and sales promotion team and customers' interpretation of communication. It's called as the interpretation gap. The last gap is in between the customer's interpretation of the communication and the customer experience that they get. That's called as the service gap. Let's understand each gap. The first gap is the knowledge gap. Now, this is the difference in between what service providers believe customers expect and customers' actual needs and expectations. The second gap is the standard gap. Here, the difference is in between the management's perception of customers' expectations and the quality standards established for service delivery. The third gap is the delivery gap. Here, it's a difference in between the specified delivery standards and the service provider's actual performance on these standards. The next gap is internal communication gap. This is the difference in between what companies, advertising and sales personnel think are the product's features or performance or service quality level is and what actually the company delivers. The next gap is the perception gap. Here it is the difference in between what is in the fact delivered and what customers perceive they have received, because many a times customers are unable to evaluate the service quality. The next gap is the interpretation gap. This is the difference in between what a service provider's communication efforts promise and what a customer thinks was promised by these communication. The last gap is the service gap. This is the difference in between what customers expect to receive and their perception of the service that is delivered. Now, when we talk about external gaps, the knowledge gap, perception gaps, the interpretation gap, and the service gaps are considered as external gaps. And the internal gaps are the standards gap, delivery gap, and the internal communication gap. This is my reference slide. I hope you have watched the video carefully. Now the quiz link is in the video description. If you have liked the video, do like it, share it, and subscribe to it. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you and I will see you for the next session.